Hi everyone, how are you? I hope you're all safe and sound. Yesterday I was having an amazing fun chat with Rob Benny, who's the musician behind Cucurbitophobia. Cucurbitophobia, for those who doesn't know, means the fear to pumpkins. So it's the symbol of fear. Okay? So he makes kind of different environmental ambient horror music for films, for horror games, for that ambient every horror material needs. His methods are so different. He just go out in the woods to look for those noises, so it makes it so sensorial, so real. And of course, he's an absolutely cool guy, and you're gonna enjoy so much hearing about his experience. We talk a bit about of everything, so stay tuned and enjoy. As always, I'll link everything below. Take care. I love you. Anything you need, just let me know. Bye bye.
One. Okay, we're good.
Okay, yes, amazing. Okay, then, well, I'm so happy to be here with you today because, well, we've been working together for quite a while now.
Oh yes, it's been at least a couple of years now, and it's
Yeah,
time just goes by so super
that's
quickly considering
it just
what's been going
flies.
on.
Yes. So one thing that I have always been curious about is where does your band name comes from? Cucurbitophobia.
Oh
I know it's like it's the phobia against pumpkins, right? That's
yes.
what it means. What's the seed of that?
It just stuck out to me. I was thinking about different various names to put for this project, and I wanted something more mysterious that people wouldn't understand at first, something that's not always used every day, something not very generic. So I was looking around for many different names, and there were some names I came across that I liked, some that I just thought were okay. But when I saw this name, I'm thinking to myself, I can come up with a really neat logo with this that has that old Celtic look and that really
Yeah.
horrifying look that can, really encapsulate the project.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I think it's a very good symbol because if you can think of an image, an horror image, it's the pumpkin and the skull, right?
Absolutely.
Yes, so everyone will attach these two concepts. So, and I've been checking all of you, all of your work, and I'm a very fan of your work because I think your music reminds me very much of the old Indian Samain kind of sounds.
Oh, very
So
interesting.
yes, I mean maybe I'm completely wrong.
No, you're not wrong. No, I just find it very interesting,
Really?
and yeah.
Yes. So what's your inspiration? What's the origin of your music?
I draw from all different sources. See,
Hmm.
I studied classical music for a long time throughout
Huh?
college and beyond, and I wasn't just into Beethoven and traditional classical material of that variety, but I started getting into the experimental 21st and 20th century music from many different
Hmm.
composers and people who did music that was very out of the box and very avant-garde, things that initially would have turned people away years ago because it had a very jarring and very dissonant approach. But a lot of it, showed up throughout movies in the 70s, like The Exorcist, and
Yeah. Hmm.
in movies in the 80s, like the Child's Play movies and Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. A lot of those scores had a lot of those different elements from different styles of world music that weren't really you know captive to an audience that were just used to traditional European classical music that had a very
Hmm.
good harmony with lots of pleasant resolutions. A lot of this music
Yeah.
just left you on edge and left you very suspended and wondering what's going to happen next. A lot of people didn't like it, but I just fell in love with it because I saw how it was employed in a lot of horror movies and sci-fi movies, and I decided to do my own brand of it.
Well, that's amazing. So, well, it's true that classical music, it's really the background of very important horror movies. So, is there a one movie that made your mind make this kind of decision? Is there
That's
one moment that you can remember?
Yeah, it sounds pretty cliched, and a lot of people might think it is, but the first Halloween with John Carpenter's score. I mean, that score was just amazingly. It was very simple.
Yeah.
There's not much to it. It was very precisely done, and there wasn't a lot of bells and whistles, but that score stuck out to me. That's the number one. If I had to pick a number two, I would probably say Psycho, Bernard Herrmann's score to Psycho, because that was very
Yeah.
ahead of its time and very, very scary when you're hearing that in your early teens, when you haven't watched many movies at that age. All of a sudden, you're watching Psycho and you're listening to this music and you're going, "What is this?" But yet
Yeah.
you find it
Yeah.
more intriguing and you get closer to it and you're more like, "Wow, this is some really good music, even if it sounds very harsh and very, very eerie."
Yes. And it's there because we all have our classic movie that we love, but in the actual nowadays horror, is there any movie you love?
I love from the post 2010s. I like the Insidious movies.
Oh, I love them.
Yes,
Oh,
those
I
those are some of
love
my
them.
favorites. I love
Yeah.
those because, like, just from the very first movie, just the very otherworldly, paranormal imagery that strikes you is just very unsettling, and the music that was done with that gave me the chills. And I would say that's one of my favorite franchises from the 2010s and beyond so far.
I'm so happy you say that because when someone asks me what's the best horror movie, not from classic, but from these latest years, I always say Insidious.
Yes.
Insidious, yeah, and you're the first one that I find that says the same because it's really, it gives you nightmares. I mean, I consume a
Yeah.
lot of horror, and Insidious has this kind of psychological atmosphere, that really gets to you.
Yes,
So
and
yes, and it's some images, like those kind of images you think of when you're alone in your house that you shouldn't.
yeah, it's
So,
it's it's just great because the way it was played out, like the first one had a very brilliant concept, and then even the sequels held up very well. A lot of movies fall flat on the sequel, but
yeah.
usually, in many cases, the second or third movie is nowhere near as, profound as the first one. But with Insidious, I thought everything was pretty well consistent throughout the series, so I was happy with that.
Yes, they got to grab the essence of the movie. They made amazing with it. And well, you have a recent album, right? Next
Uh-huh.
is Insidious, right?
Yes.
So that you have four tracks,
Hmm.
and that one is 17 minutes, and then three other compositions on it.
Yes.
Can you tell me a bit about it?
Well, next it's Insidious, the 17-minute track. I wanted to show off more of my metal background because I grew up,
Mm-hmm.
I was a very strict metalhead for a long time, and I still love
Ah,
metal. I mean,
great.
I love all types of music, but metal is one of my favorites. And I'm talking
Okay.
like the darker metal, like Slayer is one of my favorite bands of all time.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also say Death is another one of my favorite bands because Chuck Schuldiner was just a genius when it came to writing, riffs and guitar patterns. And some of those influences spilled over into Nexus Insidious. But I also incorporated a little bit of the industrial influences because
Mm-hmm.
I love and respect Trent Reznor's music from Nine Inch Nails, and I love Ministry. So I kind of drew from that and added that to the mix, and incorporated the 80s gothic horror elements within the underscore arrangements with it and tried to just make this epic style tune.
Mm-hmm. And what's the process to when you're creating? When you say I want to make, maybe you think I want to create a track that evokes this kind of feeling, industrial, or this kind of I don't know, the old house atmosphere. What's the process to create?
It's interesting. It just comes naturally. It just really depends on my mood, and sometimes it just comes upon me in an unexplained sort of way. Sometimes I'll be literally walking home from work or taking a drive somewhere, and then an idea will spring to mind, and then within a week I'll have a new song mapped out. Sometimes I have to sit there and try a few different ideas in order to get an arrangement in my head, but there's really no one predictable pattern. It just comes naturally in different ways, and I just explore those different ways of writing and creating. And I try not to make a formula out of it where it's like everything has to be done one way, because I've tried that in the past, and sometimes that's frustrating because then it's
Yeah.
easy to fall into a rut and
Mm.
not get out of that rut. So now I just sort of let it flow.
And also, not only the process, but when you're creating a track or a piece, do you think maybe, I mean, when you're setting it up, to think maybe if it's meant for a horror game, for example, you think maybe if I do this way, it would feel more like the background for
Oh
a
yeah.
horror game or for a movie, because it's completely different,
Oh
right? So
yeah.
does this has any influence on when you are creating?
Oh yeah, I think of different sounds and different styles on the synthesizers, because I know the synthesizer sounds can make a very big difference. Some of which can sound like old school video games from the like Sega and Nintendo era versus movies of like the independent variety. Sometimes the sounds overlap, but sometimes when you're working with equipment that isn't very sophisticated, you can use your imagination and create something that emulates the older movies or the video games that were more vintage. So I try to, explore those different avenues and use different sounds that might fit into that category. Sometimes I like to mix it up and try something more modern and vintage and blend it up.
Yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you. Do you sometimes get out of your comfort zone? Like, but for example, I draw, and if it was because of my mind, I would always draw the same, because it's where you're comfortable. So, abstracting that to music, is there some time that you say, no, I want to do this, but let's try that. Let's try something
Yes.
out. Yeah.
Absolutely. I did that last year on my Solstice album, where I,
Uh-huh.
wrote a very wintry themed album that was more fantasy based and had some horror elements, but sounded much more like a Disney film or a Tim Burton film, where I wanted to take more majestic approach to writing and created something that, actually sold a lot more streams and downloads than a lot of my other
Yeah.
albums. So it's funny how it worked out.
Yeah, that must be something. I don't know, a dilemma in your work, like what it's good to sell and what it's good for your soul.
That's a
Right?
tough one. That's a tough
Yeah.
balance, and a lot of artists and musicians I've spoken to have those similar dilemmas. Some who really want to maintain one set of artistic principles, where others don't have any and are just looking to only make money. And I
Yeah,
feel like
exactly.
there has to be a happy medium somewhere, because I feel like it's good to be rewarded for what you do and get some gain back from what you put out. But if you're only doing it for that, that's when you lose the essence and the music becomes too mechanical and it becomes too contrived, and then it
Hmm.
it, it doesn't appear as sincere or as interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That makes me think of when I started in this world, I wasn't focusing on horror. I was just working with authors in general. And there was a moment where I said, I have to focus on horror, because if you're everywhere, you're nowhere.
That's
Right?
that's a great point. That's an excellent point. Like sometimes you
Yes.
want to be heard and be exposed and meet new people and talk to new people, but sometimes too much of that can sometimes steer you in the other direction, and sometimes it might hold you back from your ultimate goal.
Yes, exactly. It liquids your essence somehow, right? So
Oh
I
yeah.
think there's too many people doing a lot of everything. So I really think it's good to just focus. And sometimes it has to be difficult, because maybe you're doing something that it's not selling that much, and you clearly see what is selling, but you keep on doing what you're doing. And I think what that's important, because
Oh yeah.
sometimes as a consumer, you look for something specific and you don't find it,
Hmm.
because a lot of people is adapting to everything. So this, I don't know, that we have this androgenic kind of material, right? Like fantasy and horror, the line is thin, metal and romance, it's also mixed. So sometimes you need something that's really focused on that. And I think in music it must be difficult for you to follow
It,
that road.
it is, but it's also fun too. And I feel like sometimes the
Mhm.
roads less traveled are interesting because you get, something for everybody. Sometimes you might get a different set of fans for one album, but other fans might like a completely different album. And at the end of the day, I think, it's still back to the source of my creativity. And if different people appreciate a different aspect of that creativity, that's wonderful.
Yeah, and how has your creativity evolved through time? The music you made at the beginning, and how is it now?
Good question. That I would say with production, I've learned some different production techniques and audio mixing techniques that I haven't learned in the past. I've also been creative with different sounds and using the mixer to create different sounds in non-traditional ways, to use different instruments or play the guitar with different settings that would not normally be heard on an album, and then really mess around with it on the modulator, and it would create this really warped out science fiction type
Yeah,
drone. And things like that just, are fun because it allows me to be creative and stay creative.
that's amazing. And I think that's really what fans are looking for, something creative and something different, because we see a lot of the same. So,
Oh yeah, there's a lot of
right?
rock bands and a lot of metal bands and punk bands that they pretty much make a
Yeah,
sound where it's you hear one song, you might as well have heard the whole album because everything's going to sound
exactly.
exactly the same. If it works and if it's good for them, that's great. Just for my own taste, though, I just like to do different things and make every track somewhat different or every album somewhat different, so people can go, like what style is this, or where, or what is he going to do next?
Yeah, exactly. That's, well, being different is what makes people remember you. Because when you hear that track from The Shining, The Exorcist, I mean, you completely recognize it, right? So
Absolutely.
it's so important to have that, how you say it, that print on
Oh, of
your
course.
music, so people can recognize it. That's so important. Like sometimes some people have asked me to make illustration for children,
Hmm.
and I do it, but it's not my thing, and sometimes I think I'm not even know if to sign it, because my image, my symbol, my drawings, what my drawings really are, is not that. So I guess there must be times where a musician have to do things
Oh
that,
yeah.
right, that you don't really want to attach to your brand or to your name,
Oh
right?
yeah, I mean that's why, as a musician, a lot of musicians nowadays will create a brand, but sometimes they'll create several brands for different purposes and, not try to, use any two brands to conflict one another. So if you're
Yeah.
like, if a movie director, for example, wants to make a bunch of horror films, but yet wants to also make drama and like more like nonfiction type films, he or she could
Mm-hmm.
do the same thing without overlapping them and creating a conflict of interest. I think that's a thing that people can do nowadays because there's more ways to explore and expand opportunities to do things and not necessarily be locked into one style. I do think, though, that once you become well known and once you really feel strongly about a certain style, it's it's not maybe required, but maybe it's more sensible to stick to one style that best fits you. And I think that's a good way to
Mm-hmm.
look at it too.
Yeah. Yes, it's that difficult balance. But I think the musicians or creators that stick to what they feel,
Mm-hmm.
I think that they build up a solid road for the work, their work. So, and how was your transition from classical music to horror music? How was it?
Well, it was interesting. It all kind of happened at the same time because when I was younger, I mean, when you're first in your early years, like being exposed to music, you think, oh,
Mm-hmm.
classical music must be orchestral music. Okay, it's music that people listen to, and it's just people that study to it, and you don't really think much of it. Oh, you take piano lessons. Oh, Beethoven's that guy that makes all these piano songs. That's what you're thinking when you're young. When you grow older and you start studying theory in high school and in college, and you
Yeah.
start learning history about different composers throughout the years and the centuries, you start to see how some composers just broke all the rules and how people were afraid of them. I mean, people are afraid of what they don't know, and when they hear something that they're not familiar with, it sets in that fear. Stravinsky did that same exact thing when he released The Rite of Spring, and he premiered that in France in the 1900s, and he got rioted at the show. People booed him. People did not like him at all at the time
Yeah.
because The Rite of Spring was just such a very grotesque ballet compared to, some of the
Mm-hmm.
previous ballets that were very beautiful and
Yeah.
posh.
Yeah. So, could you choose do you have a favorite classic composer that sometimes you go to still?
I would probably say that's a tough one. I'd say Stravinsky's probably my favorite. I would have to say Schoenberg is probably my second favorite. I like,
Mm-hmm.
but I also like Ives, and I like Penderecki too. Penderecki's done some great work.
Yeah. I have always been in love, even I know it's a cliche, but I have always been in love with Mozart
Oh,
because I
Mozart's great.
think, yes, I think he has a very dark history. And for example, the Requiem of Mozart, I think that the Lacrimosa or any part of Rex, like the Rex part of the Requiem, it would fit
Yes.
amazingly in any horror movie. I mean, it seems that stones are falling on you when you're listening. So, would you say that people has a prejudged idea of classical classical music can be really really dark really
Oh, of
dark.
course.
Yeah, so I think that's an amazing start for a horror musician.
Mhm.
That's an
Absolutely.
amazing because all that knowledge and inspiration and sometimes it just comes to your mind.
Of course.
And right, so I think that must be an amazing background for you. And do you have any projects with any film or game creator? Do you plan to do it?
Well, I have worked with the Midwest Horror Network. Oh,
Hmm?
sorry about that.
Don't worry.
Sorry, I got a call. I worked with my friends from the Midwest Horror Network, whom I met at the NJ Horror Con a few years ago, and they're based in Chicago, and I live near New York. So the Horror Con was in New Jersey by Atlantic City, so that's where we met and crossed paths. And ever since then, we've been working on each other's
Hmm.
projects. I recently scored a short for them called "A Stroll Through the Woods," which is on the Midwest Horror Network's channel as part of their Nightmares podcast. And
That's great.
it's an 8 minute short, but it's really cool. It shows like a police officer who goes into the woods and
Yeah.
finds a group of a cult wearing masks, all different masks,
Hmm.
different weapons, and they just
Yeah.
appear one by one, and it just creates a very like unsettling, uneasy environment with it. And I that actually showed up on my Nexus Insidious album as track 3, The Coven.
Okay. Then that's so interesting. And was it? Did you make that track for that short? It
Yes.
especially. And
Mhm.
okay, that's so interesting because when you have to make a piece for a film or a short film, what comes first, the egg or the chicken?
Um, I usually try to take the approach where I watch the film first,
Mm-hmm.
just so I can get an idea and a visual of what's going on. And it also helps me to time the certain cues within the certain sections. Now, it's interesting how it works because it's a very different approach to just recording an album.
Mm-hmm.
Once you send your blueprint back to the filmmaker or the director, they can say, okay, this should belong in this section, change this by this minute mark, or perhaps add this over here. It's a very
Mm-hmm.
different approach to just putting a song together, which I found very interesting and very challenging, but something I really enjoyed.
Well, that must be amazing. And how is it to work with a producer?
It's very good.
Yeah.
It's a different mindset. And I know a lot of musicians who probably would love to take that opportunity because it's very different than just being in a band where you're just, playing, a song with a verse, chorus, and it's a refreshing change of pace. So it's something that I would suggest to other people to try, step outside of the comfort zone and work with someone who
Yeah.
may give you a different approach to composing music altogether.
That must be a very exciting world, right? Because that you also have to meet many other people different involved with the movie. And how is that kind of world, the movie world for a musician?
It's
How do
it's
you feel in it?
it's competitive. It's very different.
Really?
It's
Yeah.
different because it's one person can do a job. You don't necessarily need to hire an orchestra in the beginning stages, and you can record and compose all of your own material at your own leisure. The only disadvantage is that the market is sometimes different because sometimes a few people may cross different genres and different types of movies and do more work, which doesn't
Yeah.
leave a lot of opportunities for independent musicians to break in. But again, I think it's a matter of just mastering timing and, seizing the right opportunity at the right time when the opportunity knocks. That's the only challenges that I think come across for anyone in this field.
Yeah. Sometimes I thought it how when you're watching a scene from a horror movie and that sound goes out in the right moment. Now, sometimes I picture the producer or the director of that movie telling the musician, "No, this has to go 2 seconds before," or something like that. You
Oh,
know,
yes,
does that happen?
yeah, every little bit adds up. Every single
Yeah.
moment of timing just makes sense. If one thing is too quickly or too late, it's like missing the surprise. If someone's walking and they see you behind the corner and they jump out,
Mhm.
it's not going to scare you. But waiting
Yeah.
a second or two later, that has to be right there. But you can't miss it either. If they walk by and you jump out, it doesn't scare them either. So timing has to be super spot on with the music and the cue and the level of surprise.
Yes, absolutely. Music is everything in a horror movie. My father is one of those people that when someone is doing something stupid in a horror movie, like going alone to the basement or something like that, my father always says, "Don't you hear the music? You know, don't do that. The music is telling you not to do that." And
Oh yeah.
that makes me think what you said, that without the music, horror scenes wouldn't be as scary.
Oh
Not at
no.
all. Like in Japanese horror movies, that they are, well, just another world,
Yes,
completely
I
different,
totally agree.
right? The little sounds that, uh, this, that disturbing things that you hear. I
Yes.
said like 80% of the movie is that, because sometimes when you still hear that noise for any reason at the street or something, you still stop and say, what was that?
Yep.
So music is everything in a horror movie. Do you feel as recognized? A musician is recognized in a movie?
Yeah, it's very cool. I think I've gotten some good feedback on what I've done with the shorts,
Mm-hmm.
and I just feel like it's given me more incentive to create more and network with more individuals too. It's a matter of just making contacts and meeting people, and submitting to different potential publishers who might be able to be that bridge to allow you to work on another project. And it's certainly a fun challenge too, because now I have new ideas swirling in my mind for future music that I'm going to start working on too.